Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand on the edge of death in total isolation, knowing the only way out might destroy the lie you've told yourself and everyone else about who you really are? I never planned to disappear. I just needed air. The kind of air that didn't carry my father's voice reminding me I was 28 and still figuring things out, or my mother's careful questions about when I would bring a nice girl home to Chicago. So I drove west from Illinois until the interstate ended and the pines began, rented a cheap cabin outside Bozeman, and told everyone I was taking a week to clear my head. What I didn't say, what I had never said out loud, was that the head I needed to clear was full of a truth I had buried so deep it felt like another organ. I had never loved a woman the way I was supposed to. Every date, every kiss, every awkward attempt at normal had left me colder than the Midwest winter I grew up in. I told myself it was stress, timing, maybe I was just wired differently. But alone on that trail the second day, with the sky turning the color of gunmetal and the wind slicing through my jacket, the lie started to crack. The storm hit faster than the forecast. 1 minute I was following the marked path along the Gallatin River. The next the trail vanished under 6 inches of sudden snow and the river roared like it wanted to swallow me whole. My phone had no signal. My pack was soaked. I slipped twice, once hard enough to twist my ankle, and by the time I crawled under an overhang of rock I was shaking so badly I couldn't feel my fingers. Night fell like a curtain. I curled into a ball and waited for morning or death, whichever came first. That was when the question really hit me, not as a thought but as a physical ache in my chest. What if the only person who could pull me out of this was the one man who would force me to stop pretending? I don't know how many hours passed. I drifted in and out, teeth chattering, memories flashing like broken film. My high school best friend Marcus laughing at a joke I never quite got. The way my stomach flipped when our college roommate changed shirts in front of me. The night I almost told my sister and then swallowed the words with cheap beer instead. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the same face. Not a woman, never a woman. Just the vague outline of broad shoulders and quiet strength I had spent years pushing away. I hated how honest fear made me. A sound cut through the wind, boots on rock, deliberate, steady. I tried to call out, but my voice was gone. Then a flashlight beam sliced the darkness and a figure dropped to one knee beside me. He was tall, maybe 6'3", bearded, wearing a faded red flannel and a battered Carhartt jacket that smelled of wood smoke and pine resin. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, steady and unreadable. "Easy," he said, voice low and calm like he talked to frightened animals every day. "Name's Ryder. You're not dying on my mountain tonight." He didn't ask questions. He just moved. One arm slid under my knees, the other around my back, and he lifted me like I weighed nothing. I remember the heat of his chest against my cheek and the ridiculous thought that I had never been held by anyone who felt that solid. Then blackness took me. When I woke I was inside a small cabin that smelled of coffee and cured meat. A wood stove crackled. My ankle was wrapped, my clothes dry and folded on a chair. Ryder stood at the counter slicing something. Back to me. The storm still howled outside, but here the world was small and warm and terrifying because I was alive and I had no idea what came next. "You're awake," he said without turning. "Coffee's hot. Drink it slow." I sat up too fast and the room spun. He was at my side in 2 steps, steadying my shoulder. His hand was rough, calloused, but gentle. I looked up and our eyes locked again. Something inside me shifted, like a key turning in a lock I had sworn didn't exist. "Thank you," I managed. "I'm Nathaniel. I don't know how I got so turned around." He gave a short nod, poured coffee into a tin mug, and handed it over. "People get turned around out here all the time. Usually they're running from something." "You," I sipped and burned my tongue. The truth sat on my tongue like a live coal. I swallowed it back down. Just needed space. Ryder studied me for a long second, then went back to the counter. "Space is what the wilderness gives. Sometimes more than you ask for." That was the first night. He fed me venison stew, told me the storm would last at least 3 more days, and offered me the only bed while he took the couch. I lay there listening to the wind and the even rhythm of his breathing across the room, and for the first time in years I didn't feel alone. I felt seen, and that scared me more than the mountain ever had. By morning the snow had piled against the windows like a wall. Ryder moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking traps he'd set before the storm, splitting kindling, boiling water. I hobbled after him, useless but desperate to do something. He didn't mind. He handed me a knife and a chunk of dried meat and said, "Cut it thin. Keeps your hands busy." We talked in fragments. He was 41, had lived off-grid for 12 years after leaving the Marines. No wife, no kids, no interest in people who need streetlights to feel safe. I told him about Chicago, the marketing job that paid well and meant nothing, the family that loved me but only the version of me they could understand. I left out the part that mattered. He didn't push. On the third day, the wind died enough for him to check his perimeter. I insisted on going with him even though my ankle throbbed. The world outside was white and silent and beautiful in a way that hurt. Ryder moved like the snow belonged to him. Half a mile from the cabin, we found a mule deer caught in a drift, still alive but exhausted. He knelt, spoke soft words I couldn't hear, then ended its suffering with one clean shot. I watched him field dress it with practiced hands and felt something twist in my gut. Not disgust, but awe. This man lived in a world where death and mercy were the same gesture. Back at the cabin, he hung the meat and we sat by the stove. The silence stretched until he broke it. "You're not just lost on the trail, Nathaniel. You're lost somewhere else too. I can see it in your eyes." I stared into the fire. The question that had haunted me on the rock came back louder. What if I am? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into tin cups and handed me one. "Then you're in the right place. Wilderness doesn't care who you love. It only cares if you're willing to stay alive long enough to figure it out." I drank. The burn matched the one in my chest. For the first time, I let myself look at him, not as my rescuer, but as a man. The line of his jaw under the beard, the way his shoulders filled the flannel, the quiet strength in every movement. My pulse kicked. I looked away fast. That night, the storm returned harder. The power went out, the generator struggled, and we sat in firelight. He told me about a buddy from the Marines who died in Afghanistan, how that loss taught him not to waste time on lies. I told him about the girlfriend I broke up with 6 months ago because every time she touched me I felt hollow. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Ryder nodded once, like he already knew. Some of us spend years trying to be what the world wants. Then one day the world drops us in the snow and says, "Now what?" I laughed, shaky. "Yeah, now what?" He reached over and squeezed my good knee, brief, brotherly, but the touch lingered like a brand. "Now you rest. Tomorrow we'll see if the pass is clear. If not, we've got time." I lay awake long after he slept, heart hammering. The secret wasn't buried anymore. It was sitting across the room, breathing steadily, and it had a name: Ryder. The next morning the sky was a hard blue and the snow had stopped. Ryder packed a small sled, said the ranger station was 2 days' hike if we moved careful. I wanted to go. I also never wanted to leave. We stepped outside and the cold hit like a slap. He adjusted my pack, checked my ankle wrap, and for a second his hand rested on my lower back. Neither of us spoke. We just started walking. The trail was brutal, but Ryder knew every root and rock. We stopped at noon beside a frozen creek. He built a quick fire, boiled snow for tea, and we shared the last of the venison. The sun warmed the snow until it sparkled like diamonds. I looked at him across the flames and the question came out raw. What happens when we get back to the real world? Ryder stared into the distance. Depends on what you decide the real world is. I swallowed. I think I've been lying to mine for a long time. He met my eyes. Then maybe it's time to stop. The wind picked up again, but this time it felt like it was carrying something new. We packed up and kept moving. By dusk we reached an old trapper's lean-to. We built a shelter inside it and shared the single sleeping bag because the temperature dropped below 0. His body heat against my back was the only thing keeping me alive, and I realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. That was the night everything changed without a single word spoken. I turned in the dark, found his face inches from mine, and whispered the truth I had never said to another soul. I'm gay, Ryder, and I think I've been falling for you since the moment you picked me up in the snow. He was quiet so long I thought he'd pull away. Then his hand found mine under the bag. Took you long enough to say it out loud. His thumb brushed my knuckles once, twice. No more. But it was enough. In that freezing lean-to, trapped between mountains and the life I used to live, I finally felt free. The next 2 days blurred into a rhythm of survival and silence that somehow said everything. We made it to the ranger station by late afternoon on the second day. The ranger, a grizzled woman named Carla, radioed for help and gave us hot soup while we waited for the snowmobile rescue. Ryder sat beside me on the bench, knee touching mine under the table, and neither of us moved away. Carla noticed but said nothing. People who live in the wild learn to mind their own business. The ride down the mountain was loud and fast and felt like leaving a dream. When we reached the trailhead parking lot, my rental car was buried under 2 feet of snow. Ryder helped dig it out, then stood back with his hands in his pockets while I brushed off the windshield. So, he said, Chicago's calling. I looked at the keys in my hand and felt them weigh 1,000 pounds. It is. But I don't think I'm the same guy who left. He gave that half-smile I was already addicted to. Nobody ever is after the mountain gets hold of them. I wrote my number on the back of a trail map and handed it to him. If you ever come down from the clouds, he tucked it into his jacket without looking. I don't make promises I can't keep, Nathaniel. But I don't forget people either. Then he turned and walked back toward the tree line like the forest was home and the rest of the world was just a place he passed through. I watched until the pines swallowed him. The drive back to Bozeman was the loneliest 4 hours of my life. Back in Chicago, the city felt too loud, too bright, too full of people who expected me to be the same Nathaniel who left. My sister picked me up at O'Hare and hugged me so hard I almost cried. Over Thai takeout that night, I told her the edited version. Lost, rescued, safe. She asked about Ryder and I shrugged like he was just a guy. Inside, every cell remembered the weight of his hand on mine. Work was worse. My boss wanted the campaign report. My coworkers wanted gossip about my adventure. I gave them both and smiled the smile I had practiced for years. At night, I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling and replayed every moment on the mountain. The way Ryder said my name like it mattered. The quiet when he listened instead of fixing me. The single thumb stroke across my knuckles that felt bigger than any kiss I'd ever had. A week passed. Then 2. I started running along the lakefront at dawn because movement helped. One morning my phone buzzed with an unknown Montana number. I almost dropped it. You still alive down there, city boy? Ryder's voice was the same low rumble, but now it traveled through satellites and still managed to settle in my chest. Barely, I laughed. How's the snow? Melting. Passes open. Thought maybe you'd want to know. We talked for 43 minutes. He told me about a bear that tore up his cache. I told him about the client who screamed at me over font choices. Normal things. But underneath was the current we both felt and neither named. When we hung up, I stared at the phone like it was a live wire. That was the beginning of the calls. Twice a week at first, then more. He sent pictures, his cabin in summer green, a trout he caught, the view from the ridge where he first found me. I sent back city shots that felt fake next to his. Slowly the truth leaked out in pieces. He told me he'd known he was gay since he was 17, but the Marines and the mountains made it easier to keep quiet. I told him about the night I almost kissed my best friend in college and then drove home crying instead. Each confession felt like peeling off another layer of winter gear. 3 months after the storm, my sister cornered me at family dinner. You've been different since Montana. Lighter. But also somewhere else. Who is he? I froze with fork halfway to my mouth. My father looked up from his steak. My mother's eyes went wide. The lie sat there ready to roll off my tongue like it always had. Instead, I set the fork down. His name is Ryder. He saved my life. And I'm in love with him. The table went still. My father's face turned the color of old paper. My mother pressed a hand to her chest. My sister just smiled like she'd known all along. The shouting started 5 seconds later. Disappointment, confusion, biblical quotes I'd heard since childhood. I let it wash over me. For the first time, the noise didn't drown me. I had already survived a mountain that wanted me dead. Family words were just wind. That night I called Ryder. I told them. He was quiet a beat. How'd it go? About like you'd expect. But I'm still standing. Good man, he said, and the pride in his voice made me close my eyes. You want company while you keep standing? I laughed through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. You offering? Already bought the plane ticket. Be there Friday. I hung up and stared at the Chicago skyline outside my window. The city lights looked smaller now, less like walls and more like stars I could walk under if I chose. Ryder was coming. The secret was out. And for the first time, the wilderness inside me felt wide open instead of suffocating. He landed at O'Hare in a flannel shirt and boots that looked ridiculous on airport carpet. I met him at baggage claim, and for a second we just stood there, 2 feet apart, the noise of wheels and announcements swirling around us. Then he pulled me into a hug, hard, brief, everything, and I breathed in pine and wood smoke and the man who had dragged me back from the edge. Missed you, Nathaniel. Missed you more. We took the train to my apartment because I wanted to show him my world. He looked at the glass towers and crowded sidewalks like they were another planet. Inside my place, he set his duffel down and turned in a slow circle. Smaller than my cabin, he said with a grin. But it smells like you. We didn't rush anything. That first night we cooked pasta together. Him chopping vegetables with the same steady hands that had field-dressed a deer, me burning the garlic because I couldn't stop watching him. After dinner we sat on the couch with beers and talked until the city outside went quiet. When he finally leaned in and kissed me, it was soft, careful, like he was afraid the city might break us. Didn't. Felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. The next weeks were a strange dance. Ryder tried Chicago. He hated the noise but loved the lake at sunrise. I took him to my favorite bookstore and he bought 3 books on survival psychology. My sister met him for coffee and declared him quietly perfect. My father refused to meet him. My mother sent a careful text that said she was trying. I learned that love in the city came with paperwork and opinions and therapists who wanted to process. Love on the mountain had been simpler. Stay alive, tell the truth, hold on. One night after a brutal day at work, I came home to find Ryder had cooked elk steaks he'd shipped from Montana and set the table with candles he bought at the corner store. I stood in the doorway and felt the question rise again. Not the old one about secrets, but a new one. Could I live in both worlds? He saw it on my face. You don't have to choose tonight, he said. But you do have to eat before it gets cold. We ate. We talked. Later, lying in bed with the window open to the hum of traffic, he traced the scar on my ankle from the fall. This mark, he said, is where your old life ended and the real one started. Doesn't matter where we live. It matters that we carry it together. I turned to face him. I want to go back. Not forever. But long enough to remember who I am when the trees are the only ones listening. He smiled in the dark. Then we go back. Together. The flight to Bozeman felt like stepping through a portal. Ryder drove us up the winding road in his old pickup while I hung my arm out the window and let the pine air hit my face. When we reached the cabin, the snow was gone and everything was green and loud with birds. I stood on the porch and felt the mountains settle into my bones again. The first week was pure honeymoon with survival. Ryder taught me to split wood without losing fingers, how to read animal tracks, which berries would kill me and which would keep me alive. I taught him how to make a decent latte with the espresso machine I'd lugged up in my suitcase. We laughed more than I had in years. At night we lay on the roof watching stars so bright they hurt, and he told me stories of the men he'd loved and lost before the mountains claimed him. I told him about the years I spent dating women because it was easier than explaining to my family. Each story wove us tighter. But the real world didn't stay away. My sister called to say Dad had a heart scare. Not serious, but enough to make him rethink things. She asked if I would come home for a weekend. Ryder saw my face when I hung up. Go, he said. I'll be here when you get back. Family's a different kind of wilderness. I flew back alone. The dinner was tense but different. Dad didn't yell. He just looked tired and asked, "Does this Ryder make you happy?" I said yes. Mom cried. My sister hugged me at the door and whispered, "I'm proud of you." When I landed back in Montana, Ryder met me at the airport with wildflowers he'd picked himself. We drove straight to the ridge where he first found me. The rock overhang was still there, now covered in summer moss. "Same place," he said. "Different man." I kissed him right there under the open sky and felt the last piece of the old lie fall away. Summer stretched long and golden. We hiked deeper into the backcountry. One afternoon we came across a group of hikers, 3 guys and a woman who had lost the trail. Ryder helped them without hesitation, sharing water and directions like it was nothing. I watched him and realized this was who he was. The man who showed up when others were lost. Later that night, I told him I wanted to learn to do the same. He started teaching me tracking in earnest. We spent days following elk paths, learning to move quiet, learning to listen. I fell more times than I cared to count, but each time he pulled me up and the touch lingered longer. One evening we reached a high meadow at sunset. The sky turned every shade of fire and the mountains looked like they were on fire too. Ryder spread a blanket and we lay back watching the light fade. "I never thought I'd share this with anyone," he said quietly. "Not like this." I rolled onto my side. "I never thought I'd be someone worth sharing it with." He pulled me close and we stayed there until the stars came out. No grand declarations. Just the steady beat of his heart under my ear and the knowledge that I had finally stopped running. But tension was building elsewhere. My job in Chicago wanted me back for a major campaign. They offered a raise and remote work as a compromise. Ryder said he understood if I needed the money. I said the money had never kept me warm on a freezing night. We argued, not angry, but real. He worried I would resent the quiet. I worried he would resent the city when it came calling again. That night we slept on opposite sides of the bed for the first time. The space felt bigger than the whole mountain. Morning brought clarity. I turned to him before the sun was fully up. "I'm not choosing the city. I'm choosing us. We'll figure the rest out." He kissed me slow and deep and the argument dissolved like mist. We spent the day building a small addition to the cabin. Nothing fancy, just a corner where I could set up a laptop and still see the trees. It felt like a promise made with hammers and sweat. Fall arrived with golden aspens and the first frost. We made our first trip together to town for supplies. At the general store, an old-timer recognized Ryder and clapped him on the back. Then he looked at me and said, "Heard you got yourself a partner. Good for you, son." The casual acceptance hit me harder than any Chicago therapy session. On the drive back, Ryder glanced over. "People up here don't waste time on hate. Too much else to survive." I laughed. "Maybe we should all move to the mountains." He grinned. "Told you the wilderness doesn't care who you love." Winter crept in early. One night the generator failed and we huddled by the stove again like the first time. This time there was no fear. Only warmth and the sound of snow on the roof and the man I loved breathing beside me. I traced the line of his jaw in the firelight and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." He caught my hand and pressed it to his chest. "Thank you for letting me." That was the night I knew we had built something stronger than survival. We had built a life. The first real test came in December. My father had a second health episode, this one serious enough for surgery. My sister called crying. I booked the next flight out. Ryder drove me to the airport through a blizzard and didn't say much until we reached the terminal. "I can come with you," he offered. I shook my head. "This one I have to do alone. But I'll be back before the new year." He kissed me right there in the drop-off lane. Flannel collar dusted with snow, and drivers honked but neither of us cared. "Call me every night," he said. "Even if it's just to breathe." Chicago in winter felt like another planet. Hospital lights were too bright, the beeping machines too loud. Dad looked small in the bed. When he woke after surgery, the first thing he asked was, "Is Ryder here?" I told him no. He nodded once and said, "Bring him next time. I want to meet the man who made my son brave enough to tell the truth." I cried in the hallway. Mom hugged me and for the first time said, "I'm sorry we made it so hard." My sister and I sat in the cafeteria drinking terrible coffee, and she told me she had started volunteering at an LGBTQ youth center. "Your story changed me," she said. "Figured it could change some kids too." Every night I called Ryder. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes we just listened to each other breathe across the miles. He sent pictures of the cabin buried in snow and the new addition with my laptop already set up waiting for me. I sent him pictures of the hospital cafeteria and the skyline that no longer felt like home. Christmas came while I was still there. We had a quiet dinner in Dad's hospital room, takeout Chinese and paper hats my sister brought. Dad raised a plastic cup of apple juice and said, "To Nathaniel and Ryder, may the mountains keep you safe." It was the closest he had ever come to acceptance, and it cracked something open in all of us. I flew back the day after New Year. Ryder met me at baggage claim wearing the same red flannel I remembered from the storm. This time I didn't hesitate. I dropped my bag and walked straight into his arms in front of everyone. He lifted me off the ground for a second and the airport noise disappeared. "Welcome home," he whispered. The drive up the mountain was slow because of fresh snow, but we didn't mind. Inside the cabin he had built a fire and hung a single strand of lights along the mantel, his version of holiday decorating. We sat on the rug and I told him everything. When I finished, he pulled me close and said, "Your family's learning. Mine never did. But we get to build our own now." That winter we learned each other in new ways. I taught him how to use video calls for my remote meetings. He taught me how to ice fish on the frozen lake. We argued about whether to get a satellite internet dish. I won. And whether to adopt a rescue dog from the shelter in Bozeman. He won. The dog, a mutt we named Summit, turned out to be the best compromise. He slept between us at night and reminded us every day that love could be simple and loud at the same time. Spring brought visitors. My sister flew out for a week. She and Ryder got along like they had known each other forever. She helped us plant a small garden and laughed when Ryder explained that city dirt was nothing like mountain dirt. On her last night, we sat on the porch watching the sunset and she said, "You two look like you belong here." "I'm jealous." I told her she could visit any time. She hugged me and whispered, "Dad's asking about plane tickets for summer. Don't tell him I told you." The news felt like another layer of healing. But it also stirred old fears. What if my family came and hated the quiet? What if Ryder hated the extra people? That night I lay awake until he rolled over and pulled me against his chest. "Stop borrowing trouble from tomorrow," he murmured. "We survived a blizzard together. We can survive in-laws." I laughed into his shoulder and finally slept. Summer arrived with wildflowers and long days. We took our first real vacation. Not away from the mountain but deeper into it. We backpacked for 10 days into the Bob Marshall wilderness. No phones, no schedule, just trails and sky and each other. On the 8th night, we camped beside a turquoise lake. The stars were so thick they looked like spilled milk. Ryder built a small fire and we roasted the trout we'd caught. After dinner, he pulled something from his pack, a small wooden box he had carved himself. Inside was a simple silver band etched with tiny mountain peaks. "Not a proposal," he said quickly. "Not yet. But a promise that wherever we go, city, mountain, anywhere, I'm in this with you. No more running. No more hiding." I slid the ring onto my finger and it fit perfectly. Then I kissed him until the fire burned low and the only light left was the one between us. When we returned to the cabin, the satellite internet was full of messages. My boss wanted a face-to-face in Chicago. My father had booked flights for July. Ryder's old Marine buddy was getting married in Denver and wanted us both there. Suddenly our quiet world felt crowded. We sat on the porch with Summit at our feet and made a list. Some things we would say yes to, some no, some together. That evening I realized the greatest gift the wilderness had given me wasn't survival. It was the courage to choose my life instead of letting it choose me. I looked at Ryder, beard a little grayer, eyes still the same steady gray, and knew I had chosen right. July brought the first real collision of our two worlds. My parents flew into Bozeman wearing city clothes that looked ridiculous next to the pickup trucks. Ryder and I met them at the airport. Dad shook Ryder's hand like he was meeting a business partner, stiff but sincere. Mom hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The drive to the cabin was quiet except for Summit's happy barking in the back seat. The first 2 days were careful. Mom helped in the garden even though she kept asking what everything was. Dad sat on the porch with Ryder and talked about the Marines and the stock market in the same sentence. I watched them and felt a strange pride. My two fathers, different as mountains and skyscrapers, finding common ground. On the third day we took them on an easy hike to the ridge. Dad's heart was strong enough now, but we kept the pace slow. At the overlook where I had once thought I would die, the four of us stood in silence. The view stretched forever. Dad turned to Ryder and said, "You saved more than his life up here. You saved the part of him we almost lost." Ryder just nodded once, the way he did when words weren't needed. That night around the fire my mother asked the question I had waited years to hear without fear. "Are you happy, Nathaniel?" I looked at Ryder, at the ring on my finger, at the cabin glowing behind us, and answered without hesitation. Happier than I ever thought possible. My parents left the next morning with promises to return in the fall for hunting season. Dad's idea, not mine. Ryder and I stood on the porch waving until the truck disappeared. Then we turned to each other and laughed until our sides hurt. "We survived the in-laws," he said. "Now we celebrate." We celebrated the only way we knew how, backpacking to the same turquoise lake. This time we brought the ring and made it official under the same spilled milk stars. No ceremony, no guests, just us and the mountains as witnesses. When I slipped the matching band onto Ryder's finger, he kissed me so fiercely the world tilted. Summit barked like he approved. Back home life settled into a rhythm I had never dared dream. I worked remote 3 days a week and spent the other 4 learning to guide small hiking groups with Ryder. The first time I led a couple to the ridge without getting us lost, I felt taller than the peaks. Ryder watched from the back of the group with quiet pride that meant more than any paycheck. Fall brought Ryder's Marine buddies' wedding in Denver. We drove down together, Summit in the back seat with his head out the window. The wedding was small and military tidy. When the couple said their vows, I felt Ryder's hand find mine under the table. Later at the reception his buddy pulled us both aside and said, "Never thought I'd see you settle down, Ryder. Looks good on you." Ryder just grinned and pulled me closer. The trip back was long but peaceful. Somewhere in Wyoming we pulled over at a rest stop under a sky full of stars. Ryder leaned against the truck and said, "You know, I used to think the only way to be free was to stay up here alone. You proved me wrong." I stepped between his boots and rested my forehead against his. We prove each other right every day. Winter returned fierce and beautiful. One night the power went out again and we dragged the mattress in front of the stove just like the first time. Summit curled at our feet. Outside the wind screamed, but inside was only warmth and the steady sound of the man I loved breathing beside me. I traced the ring on his finger and whispered the question that had started everything. "What if the hunter who saved you turned out to be the love of your life?" Ryder smiled in the firelight. "Then you thank the mountain every single day." Spring arrived early the next year, and with it came the biggest decision we had faced. A publisher in New York wanted to turn Ryder's survival stories into a book. They offered good money and a tour. He asked me what I thought while we were planting potatoes in the garden. I wiped dirt from my hands and looked at the man who had once carried me through a blizzard. "If it means more people hear how the wilderness can heal what the world breaks, then we do it. But we do it together, cabin first, city second." He nodded once, the way he always did when something mattered. The book deal went through. We spent the summer writing in the mornings and guiding hikes in the afternoons. Summit learned to pose for author photos. My sister flew out to help edit and declared the manuscript the best love story she'd ever read that didn't have a single sex scene. We all laughed until we cried. The book launch was in Chicago that fall. We flew down with Summit in cargo because he refused to be left behind. The event was at a small independent bookstore downtown. My parents sat in the front row. When Ryder read the chapter about the night I finally told him I was gay, the room went so quiet you could hear pages turning. At the end of the reading, I joined him at the podium and we answered questions together. Someone asked how we made two different worlds work. Ryder looked at me and said, "We stopped trying to make them different. We just made them ours." After the signing, my father pulled us both aside. He wasn't good with words, but he managed. "I was wrong for a long time. I'm proud of the man you've become, son. And I'm proud to call Ryder family." Mom cried again, but this time they were happy tears. We flew home the next day with a suitcase full of signed books and a heart full of something even bigger. The cabin looked the same, but everything felt new. We sat on the porch that night watching the stars and Summit snoring between us. "I used to think the secret would kill me," I said quietly. "Turns out telling it saved me." Ryder took my hand. The mountain gave us both a second chance. We just had to be brave enough to take it. We sat there until the sky lightened. No more running. No more hiding. Just two men, one dog, and a life built on the simple truth that love is the only compass you really need. In the end, this story taught me that the wildest places aren't always outside us. They're the fears we carry until someone helps us face them. Ryder didn't just rescue me from a storm. He showed me that being honest about who I love doesn't make me weak. It makes me whole. The lesson is simple but hard one. Stop waiting for the world to approve of your heart. Walk into the wilderness of your own truth. And if you're lucky, you'll find the person who was always meant to walk beside you. No map required. Just courage, a little snow, and the willingness to let yourself be found.